Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everybody.
Thursday morning. We are a good, 2/3 into our first infrastructure week of the Biden administration. Are you feeling the chills, the thrills?
Well, we've had the rug pulled out from us so many times, Bill, that I'm gonna wait to see it if it happens.
I have, not a identical feeling for the Trump infrastructure weeks, which were always just, you'd say it was infrastructure week, and then like 6 other random scandals would appear, and you wouldn't talk about it, infrastructure, and there never was a serious push, never was a serious bill. Obviously, we're not going to replicate that, but I do think we might have a situation where we have a lot of infrastructure weeks because we're not getting to a final deal. That this infrastructure bill is going to be much more complicated. Maybe not. Maybe people are starting to get hip to it. Politico had a headline this week about how it's going to be a brutal slog. I think people are starting to understand that it's not instantaneously bipartisan, and it's not instantaneously unifying for Democrats. There's no simple paths to 50 or 60, and this might take a good long while. And with an uncertain outcome, it could fail. There's a chance that this doesn't pass.
Well, I do think that if infrastructure had come first, either in this administration or the last, and if it had been done in a less controversial way, that it might have come easy and it might have been bipartisan, but everything's based on context. And, the context in this case being that we just spent a lot of money on a different relief/stimulus bill that was not pursued by the Biden administration in a bipartisan way. They made a calculation, maybe right, maybe wrong, to not seek bipartisan support for that. So that's part of the context. And then I think within infrastructure itself, if you start calling things infrastructure that are not by definition infrastructure, then that makes it a little bit harder of a sell. So I don't think it's inherently. It certainly ought to be an issue that everyone could get behind, but the context, I think, makes it harder.
Well, to build upon what you just said, if we had a bona fide Trump push for an infrastructure bill, the Democrats would have accepted a whole lot less than what a lot of Democrats are going to ask for now. So in that respect, I do think getting it done for Trump would have been easier than it is for Biden. Now, for some people, expectations are through the roof, especially after how well the rescue plan went. But the rescue plan was just money for everybody. There was no talk about tax increases and offsets and things like that.
It's money for nothing, as Mark Knopfler might say.
And I mentioned in a past Washington Monthly piece, the question is, did Biden earn political capital through the rescue plan, or did he spend political capital? And I don't think it's a cut and dry answer, because I do think that in one sense it's earned because his popularity remained relatively high after doing it. But the spend part is you got a chunk of Democrats saying, okay, we just spent a lot there. Now it's time to be fiscally responsible adults and start paying for things. And then that gets you into the question of what taxes you're going to raise, what programs you're going to cut. And I think there's less consensus on those points. Biden's doing the easier thing from a Democratic perspective and saying it's just going to be corporate tax increases, no tax increases on anybody earning under $400,000. Pete Buttigieg says that rules out a gas tax increase, which historically is what is part of infrastructure bills. At least the highway trust fund part of it, because it's been treated as a user fee. You use the roads, and so you pay for the upkeep of the roads, and that is reflected in the gas that you buy. And they haven't been able to do a fresh increase for a while because you can demagogue that. But that is the historical basis of the highway trust fund.
I had Grover Norquist on my podcast recently, and it was a little bit controversial. I got a lot of criticism from fans because, normally the podcast is, obviously tries to be intellectually honest. And I thought Grover was probably more on message than my fans. I use the term fans very loosely, than my listeners are used to. However, Grover, as you might imagine, argues that there is a trickle down effect from the lowering corporate rates equals employees making more money and more jobs. But also something I didn't know about, he said that utility prices or prices for utilities are very connected to the corporate tax rate. If he's right, then eventually, even if you just go after, corporate taxes or the rich, it's going to have an impact on a lot of Americans, not just the rich, not just corporations. And, will that reaffirm some of the stereotypes about tax and spend liberals? That remains to be seen. But does gravity ever reassert itself? And that could also be in the form of, we've talked about it here before, inflation or some sort of a debt crisis, or if you raise taxes to try to avoid that, does that have other unintended consequences?
Well, that's always the push-pull of fiscal policy. You pay for things, you raise taxes to pay for spending, in large part to counteract inflationary effects, but the more you raise taxes, you're dampening economic growth because you're taking money out of people's pockets. And the Democratic approach is, hey, if we go after the wealthy more, that's not going to have as bad of effect on economic growth because they can afford it. We're not inflicting pain there. And the Republicans like Grover Norquist always say, "Oh, that pain's going to trickle down." And that's why. And I'm not saying Grover Norquist is right on the economics here. He's certainly not my go-to source for discussing fiscal policy because he has massive skin in the game. He's anti-tax all the time. He's not an objective academic on the subject. But I think it is the case that, back as far as history is concerned, Democrats have a harder time selling tax increases because there is a vulnerability of provoking people's fears that the burden will hit them, even if the intent is not to do that.
Right, because rich people have accountants and loopholes, and they find a way to dodge or to pass along to, maybe it's to the consumer, maybe it's to their employees, whatever, to mitigate the damage or the cost that a tax hike that they might incur from a tax hike, and the middle class guy ultimately gets screwed. That's the assumption, or that it will have an impact on the economy in general because rich people will start less businesses. They'll be less incentivized to try to make more money, and that will have an impact. Now, I feel like I don't want to say it was a consensus position, but there's a lot of things right now that we've kind of forgotten. Like, I think, for example, inflation is one of them. We used to be very worried about inflation. I don't think people are worried about it anymore. And I think we're going through a process now where we're going to test, like, does raising taxes on the rich actually have these unintended consequences that will hurt us all?
Well,
or or not.
Well, we'll see if the bill passes. We don't know if the bill's going to pass yet. What's interesting to me is Biden is trying to adopt the strategy that many on the left complained that Obama did not do. That Obama didn't start with the big ask and negotiate from there, that he tried too hard to start in the middle, and then got pushed downward from that point. He was either going for 60 and trying to appeal to the Democratic moderates in his caucus, and or trying to get those handful of Republicans to come on board. And so he didn't start with single payer and negotiate the public option. He had half-hearted public option, and he negotiated down to individual mandate. So it's that sort of thing. Biden, with the rescue plan, starts at $1.9 trillion and doesn't have to negotiate down at all. He gets the whole thing. So now you see Biden going for I think $2 trillion plus. Now here's where it's a little complicated. You got AOC saying he's going too small. He should have done 10 trillion. And maybe that's a ploy to make 2 trillion seem more reasonable. But it's still with a T. It's still multi-trillion-dollar plan. It is going beyond just traditional roads and bridges infrastructure and going into human infrastructure, which is criticized before. A lot of Republicans say that's not infrastructure. This is not an infrastructure bill. This is a progressive wish list bill. So he's pushing the envelope on that front, and it's a whole bunch of tax increases, which are all targeting corporations, which is something that Democrats love and Republicans generally hate. Although maybe some Republicans are getting more open to inflicting pain on corporations these days. But my point is, Biden has not started this process with bipartisan collaboration. He started this process with a bill drafted inside the White House that is all Democratic-friendly planks, and starting the process from there. Now he says, I'm happy to talk to Republicans. I'm happy to meet with them in the Oval Office. See where we go from here. But this is my starting point. And maybe that works. I'm not saying it can't work. Sometimes you have, rock'em sock'em negotiations, and you end up in the middle somewhere. That's a halfway decent place. But because he's starting with a partisan package, you automatically get partisan attacks. So he's already getting attacked for spending too much, taxing too much, going beyond the brief of infrastructure, hurting businesses who are in need. So we'll see if you can have that initial argument and still get to compromise, or whether it poisons the well up front, and so you're left with reconciliation as your fallback, which you can do for infrastructure, but not completely. Yeah. There are things that you can't do.
I mean, you also own it completely.
Yep.
So if it succeeds, good. If it fails, you own it. And it's also, I mean, I don't know how many people like me there are around the country, or people who are like never Trumpers, some of whom voted for Biden. But I imagine that this, maybe it hasn't turned them off yet, but I would imagine that this attitude will eventually turn off the opportunity that Biden might have had to attract more conservative folks. I mean, Bill, I don't know if you remember, but I was warning, this is my recollection, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like I was warning that Democrats were going to push Biden to be more radical, to break the filibuster, to try to do, D.C. and Puerto Rico statehood and all this stuff. And I think you were basically saying, like, there's no evidence that Biden wants to do that. He's going to have to deal with Joe Manchin, and Biden's an institutionalist, and yada yada yada. And I know I wrote a piece where I said, like, the left is going to push Joe Biden. It's just he can't. And and in fairness, like, I thought that would happen in the campaign more, and it didn't happen in the campaign. And it hasn't fully happened yet. But Biden has gone. I argued that, like, Joe Biden's only mandate is to not be Donald Trump. And it does seem like he has taken this FDR LBJ thing, that he has embraced it, that he's not going to be content to be a return to normalcy type of president, that he wants to do something very big and basically a New Deal kind of thing. And I feel like I warned about that. I feel like you tried to talk me down from that. And again, I'm not saying it's happened yet, but I feel like there's a pattern now.
I think he's in between those places right now. I think he is being more partisan and more policy aggressive than I would have assumed going in. I would have thought he would have tried to set more of a bipartisan tone and then more negotiation at the onset. And then if that didn't work, then I thought he might, push harder. But I thought he'd have more robust negotiating up front, which has not happened. And he's being more open to filibuster changes, which he was much more antagonistic towards in the campaign. But it's still not doing everything. He's not saying abolish the filibuster. And he's not, and as we talked about last week, he's not pushing the envelope on all policy fronts. He's not saying, let's do these 10 bills, let's abolish this filibuster, do everything on the wish list, and boom, let's get this done next month.
Gun control, immigration.
Gun control has definitely been deprioritized, even in the wake of these mass shootings. The heavy emphasis is infrastructure. I do think, Bill, and I wrote about this at the Daily Beast a few weeks ago, it does seem like we are in the process of almost like redefining the social contract, or the understanding of the size and scope of government, which is a huge deal. And no one is paying attention to it. And even conservatives, and this goes back to the whole, like, more focused on Dr. Seuss than President Biden, but it seems like this is just sort of happening. And no one is sounding the alarm. Well, we'll see what Republicans do with the infrastructure bill. I mean, this is a bigger target for them than the rescue plan was. It was very hard to fight against checks for everybody. And I think Republicans are more comfortable talking about boondoggle spending and runaway tax increases. I mean, a lot of Republicans have been, running those plays for decades. Now, it may be that they've been Trumpified enough that they're a little more hesitant to do that, and are more comfortable on the culture war than on infrastructure stuff. But if this is going to be the big legislative debate in town for the next 6 months, the Highway Trust Fund expires 8th of September, so that's kind of like a rough deadline for at least for that piece of it. Then this may be the thing that unifies Republicans and returning to old school conservatism. We're just going to have to see how they react to this. But it's also possible, because I think the Biden team has said we're willing to do this in pieces and not do this in one single bill. And the piece of it that is most likely to get bipartisan support is the road and bridges piece. So maybe if there is enough resistance on all sides that the Democrats are not poised to get reconciliation done. Manchin has said he wants a big infrastructure bill. He wants to redo the Trump tax bill to pay for it, but that you have to go through regular order first. You need to actually go to committee, have the amendment process. I think he said bring it to the floor. And then if that doesn't work, then he's willing to go reconciliation. But that's a lot of steps to take. That's a lot of testing to see. You could end up with a road and bridges bill piece that actually gets some Republican traction if there's enough thawing and outreach on both sides.
I think it'll be curious to see how Joe Manchin ends up, because the pattern so far was, he and Sinema basically put the kibosh on the minimum wage and then waved through $1.9 trillion in spending.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
If that's going to be the pattern, then that's not going to do a whole lot to help the cause of conservatism. I mean, I'm not saying that's his job. I'm not saying that that's Joe Manchin's purpose in life. But if we were counting on him to be a check and to basically, do our bidding, that's not necessarily a great. We're not off to a great start.
If you want to help conservatism, you might want Democrats to go hog wild, spend to oblivion, think they can defy the laws of macroeconomics, fail miserably, kickstart massive inflation, and reap the political benefits afterwards.
Well, that's the acceleration strategy. Right. I mean, you could argue, let's give the left everything they want. And eventually it's going to fall apart and we'll pick up the pieces, I mean, but in the process, there's collateral damage. And so I think if you really believe that that massive spending is, and this goes to why I voted for Joe Biden in the primary and not Bernie Sanders. I mean, I could have voted for Bernie as Operation Chaos, the worse the better, as I think it was Lennon who said. But I'm not a Steve Bannonite. I think the better, the better. So,
but I don't know if it helps conservatism. It might help Republicans long term, but I don't know if it helps conservatism to have a bipartisan roads and bridges bill that spends a decent amount of money into those projects and have it all work out nicely. That still gives credibility to government spending government projects.
Well, yeah, and I think it depends on what your priorities are. If you're playing a game, and your only goal is to win back the Senate, let's say, or take the House, then maybe your strategy is different than if you actually want the best public policy outcome for the country and to influence it in a more conservative direction. So I think it's almost a matter of semantics. But again, you could argue the worse the better and everything, and give them what they want, and watch it all fall apart. Well, real people get hurt when that happens.
Do you mind if we shift gears to filibuster?
Please.
So I had a piece in the Washington Monthly that came out yesterday about talking filibuster, and it dawned on me that there's a disconnect in the argument made by the filibuster opponents who have really latched on to the notion that the filibuster is a Jim Crow relic. Obama popularized that in the John Lewis eulogy, and it got another fresh round of another fresh push after Mitch McConnell said the filibuster did not have a racist history. Although I think the McConnell team has said his words got twisted because he was talking about the literal origin of the filibuster, not that it wasn't ever used for racist purposes, but that didn't begin that way, which is true, did not begin that way, which we talked about here.
And by the way, Mitch McConnell, as I'm sure you know, Bill, had a pretty interesting and impressive civil rights record early on.
Well, early on.
It's not wild. Actually, I talked about him. You can find that interview on YouTube where I interviewed Mitch McConnell, and we talked about it at AEI.
Okay, so there is political logic in saying the filibuster is a Jim Crow relic. Abolish the filibuster. Abolish this racist thing. What has been most effective in doing in its history is squelching civil rights bills. So get rid of it. I think that's a simplistic argument, but I think it is a cohesive argument. What makes less sense is the filibuster is a Jim Crow relic, let's bring back the talking filibuster, because all of those filibusters that helped protect Jim Crow were talking filibusters, not the current incarnation of the filibuster. There's a piece in Vox, a Vox Explainer piece, that said that the modern filibuster is the Jim Crow relic, but that is not correct. The modern filibuster is post Jim Crow. The modern filibuster is after the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act and the 68 Housing Act, when in 1970, the Senate Majority Leader at the time, Mike Mansfield, it wasn't, and this is also interesting, I don't know if you know Fred Bauer, who writes at the National Review sometimes. He pointed out that, actually, let me just back here a little bit. I actually read I think it was from Sarah Blinder, is that an academic paper or a book share? It was one of those things where I saw it on the internet and I can't remember exactly where I saw it. But she and colleagues have done lots of work in the filibuster and point out that the change in 1970 was not a rule change. There was no vote to change the filibuster structure. It was the majority leader acting on his own to change how filibusters were handled. So if there was a filibuster, traditionally, you just got to play that out. The floor is occupied until the filibuster is over, or the bill proponents give up, or the filibuster critics give up. Mansfield said, okay, we got a filibuster here. I'm going to ask for unanimous consent that we shelve this filibustered bill and do other business, at least for part of the day. And that's how the silent filibuster began, because the majority was sick and tired of the filibusterers clogging up the Senate floor and preventing other business from happening. So Fred Bauer pointed out in a National Review piece, Chuck Schumer can bring back talking filibuster today by himself. Doesn't need to pass a rule change to do it. He just needs to stop asking for unanimous consent to shelve these bills, or stop asking for, often I think there are consent agreements that, okay, this bill is going to have a 60 vote threshold. Let's just cut to the chase, just accept it's going to be 60 votes, and we'll have us in the agreement for how we handle this particular bill. If Schumer stops asking for things like that, talking filibuster's back. Now, he doesn't want to do that because what the Democrats really want, or what most Democrats want, is to change the filibuster rule.
Yeah.
And weaken the rule itself, which is a different ask.
Right. Well, and Biden, I mean, if you go back to that press conference last week, and look, I think Biden, it's the same reason, like, okay, Biden is being much more, partisan and hard-nosed than we were led to believe based on his campaign. But he seems nice about it. It's like the old Southern expression about Southerners, tell them to go to hell, but have them look forward to the trip. Biden is basically doing that to Republicans, telling them to go to hell, but doing it in a nice, all shucks way. And I think, that's why his press conference, he didn't get as much. I was criticized for writing a critical piece of his press conference. Your piece was much more, I think, flattering, maybe.
My press conference take.
Yes, it was more flattering than mine.
Yes.
And I think I got criticized for writing a critical piece of his. And I think part of the reason I was criticized is he comes across as nice. Mm-hmm. And he did. He came across as mostly nice. Yeah. But not only did he suggest that that the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow. Once again, I mean, the term Jim Crow is being just bandied about lately. Everything's Jim Crow, right? But not only did Biden claim that the filibuster was a relic of Jim Crow, he said that the solution, or his first solution, would be the talking filibuster, which would arguably make things worse for Democrats. And then he claimed his evidence for how toxic and pernicious the filibuster and how ubiquitous it has become was premised by him citing Democrats filibustering, examples of Democrats.
You talk about the last year's number of cloture votes. He didn't literally say Democrats, but obviously last year it was Democrats that did it.
And this was supposed to be an example of how egregious it has become, right? And so it wasn't. I mean, that's just one example. He did not do a great job. He just seems nice, and I think that's the takeaway for most people.
Well, where I think the disconnect between the Jim Crow argument and the talking filibuster proposition is relevant is I think you have to know what it is you're asking for and what you're going to get out of it. So in my mind, it's not that talking filibuster is racist. I mean, my point about the filibuster is it's a procedural tool. Good people can use it for good things and bad people can use it for bad things. No one's mad on the Democratic side when Democrats throw the filibuster power around to stop George Bush from privatizing Social Security. Now, I think Democrats today like to argue that conservatives get more out of the filibuster than progressives do. Therefore, we're willing to sacrifice whatever good we could get out of it because we think we're gonna net gain. But that's not my argument. So talking filibuster is not inherently racist, but I think it rewards a deeply, fervently committed minority. If you're willing to take the heat that comes with occupying the floor for days and weeks on end, you're going to come out the better of that argument. The Democrats think that Republicans. I mean, I'm just saying things what people said to me on social media. So sometimes I say, people think this, and people will respond like, people don't really think that. I'm like, I'm just telling you what people have said to me on social media. I'm not saying that means that it's
it's a form of a wisdom of crowds and a focus group. Right.
I've heard that Republicans are too lazy to fight talking filibusters, indefinitely, that they don't want that many things, and so they're not going to fight everything down the line. So Democrats can maybe they'll stop at certain things, but Democrats can get more things through. I've heard that they'll public opinion will hem them in, or if it doesn't hem them in on the front end, then they'll pay the price at the election. So that'll be disincentive. And I think it's certainly likely the case that you can't talking filibuster literally everything. But the bigger the ticket, the item, the more likely a Republican's going to say, hey, I'll occupy the floor.
Yeah.
My base will like it that I occupy the floor. We get residual benefit because you can't approve judges so long as they're occupying the floor. And if I'm raising money and my base is thanking me for doing this, what's this? Why do I have to leave? And if I have to keep 41 people on the floor to do it, well, we got 50. We can rotate people out. We can have a schedule where this all works. So
I think, I mean, to me, that just mostly speaks to Biden's kind of incoherence on how to deal with it. But to me, maybe not the bigger issue, but one that sticks in my craw is everything is Jim Crow. Well, I mean, Jim Crow was government imposed racial segregation. What's happening in Georgia, we could talk about later if you want. Could be good, could be bad, could be mixed. Not Jim Crow. The filibuster, look, you could try to, and I'm not saying you, Bill Scher, but people could try to undermine the credibility or the legitimacy of this tool by throwing, I don't know if it's ad hominem is the right term for a personal attack on an instrument, but really I think the only intellectually honest kind of debate you could have is, and it's a totally legitimate debate to have on the merits, is to say, should the Senate be a majoritarian body? So I think part of it is that, the filibuster, the voting rights bill, the terms are being bandied about that I think are a bridge too far. And I don't think we're grappling necessarily with the merits of some of these things.
Well, I mean, Democrats
in
are
an intellectually honest way, I should say.
I mean, Democrats are using the term out of genuine concern for discriminatory voting rights, voting practices. I mean, the phrase Jim Crow raises the specter of when blacks were denied the franchise, when very severe barriers to voting were put up, targeting them, and making them second-class citizens, in their own country. So I don't think there's an intent to be intellectually dishonest in raising that history when talking about the kind of voter suppression tactics that we have seen. Now, I have been one to point out that these voter suppression tactics aren't working as intended. They are not as severe as what we saw in Jim Crow. And the evidence has been that Democrats can successfully use the intent as a galvanizing force to mobilize the Democratic base vote and to overcome what are essentially feeble attempts at suppression. And I wrote my piece in the Washington Monthly back in February. Tom Edsall at the New York Times has a long piece about these election issues that just came out yesterday. And there's actually some additional academic research that backs up what I was saying, particularly in regards to the Shelby County Supreme Court ruling from 2013, which is a rallying cry for a lot of Democrats. That's what essentially ended the part of the Voting Rights Act which forced various states and jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination to have to get any voting changes cleared by the federal government. So that step is no longer needed, and that has opened the door to more voter ID type stuff, other types of tactics. So Democrats have panicked about this for the past decade. I point out in my piece that Democrats have won races in almost all of these jurisdictions and states, which some people respond to me, well, that just because they won doesn't mean that there wasn't some vote that was suppressed, just means that suppression wasn't sufficient. What this new paper showed that Edsall quoted from was that this is sort of part and parcel with the voter ID research that I did cite, that it's a mobilizing focal point. It hasn't successfully suppressed vote.
Do you think that
it's totally backfired and gone the other way? So now we're seeing this Georgia bill, which is more than just stricter voter ID. There's other elements to it as well. Talk a lot about the food and water piece of it, but there's other things. Again, I can't know exactly how every element of this is going to pan out, but I think what we have seen to date suggests that it's going to do more to mobilize Democrats than suppress Democrats. And you're certainly seeing massive attempts to mobilize around it right now.
But do you think that
You're very loud.
Do you think that comparing it to Jim Crow, that using that very powerful and loaded term is part of the mobilization effort?
I mean, no question. But I don't think Democrats are using it in a cynical way. I do think they genuinely believe, and I think there is evidence to suggest that there is racist intent here, that they believe that in Georgia, African Americans mostly vote Democratic, and they're doing things to try to target that community so they don't vote as much. I just don't think it's going to work.
Right. Well, okay, so, I mean, first of all, I mean, Jim Crow was obviously, part of Jim Crow was voting, but that's only a part. I mean, it was a much more expansive thing. So that's one point. Poll taxes, literacy tests, things like that, presumably much more egregious than showing a voter ID. I think everyone should show a voter ID. I also think it should be a priority of government to make sure everyone has access.
And Georgia does have free ID options.
Yeah. So I don't think that's a ridiculously high burden, in my opinion. I also think some of the things that the bill does, it rolls back. I mean, it made sense to me. Bill, I've always wanted to encourage people to show up and vote on election day when possible. I think that some of the things the bill does are during a pandemic, it made sense to really encourage mail-in voting. I made that argument at the time, but when we're not in a pandemic, I don't know that scaling that back is necessarily evil or racist. So the food and water thing to me was the most ridiculous. I mean, I certainly think it would be improper to use it for electioneering. So if I'm wearing a campaign shirt and I'm handing out bottles of water to a line, that is electioneering if you're within 100 feet or whatever.
So it's 150 feet of the polling place and 25 feet of the line, if there is a line in the Georgia law.
That would be electioneering. But if the state wants to hand out water to people who are standing in line, why would you want to prohibit that or oppose that? So I don't know the details, but I'm not saying I agree with everything in the bill, but it strikes me. And again, there's a pattern now of at least two examples where this term is being bandied about.
Well, here's the details. And so in the Georgia law, you can't hand out food and water to anybody within 150 feet of a polling place or 25 feet of the line if the line's going past 150 feet. You don't have to be wearing a campaign T-shirt or a hat to be prevented from handing out the food and water. So the Democrats are saying this goes beyond trying to prevent inappropriate electioneering because it's capturing people who are just handing out food and water and not electioneering. And it says any person. And so there are already self-serve water stations, but by a plain reading of the law, even the poll worker couldn't hand somebody food.
Yeah.
Hold on a second.
Okay.
Now, I heard Gabe Sterling, who was the Georgia Republican election official who was criticizing Trump recently, pushing back on the fraud allegations. He is going and saying, "Hey, this is anti-electioneering. People are using the food and water loophole to quietly electioneer, and that's why we're cracking down here." So that's their argument.
Well, you could. What you could do, right? If you were, you could pick a precinct that's like 90% Democratic, and you could tell people, "Go vote, and we're going to give you pizza. If you want some free pizza, go vote. We're handing it out." And just knowing that 90% of the people show up. Now, I don't know. Has that happened? Is this a big problem that needs to be addressed? And why not allow water? I mean, I don't know anybody who's going to sell out their vote for free water. So why? I think it's just stupid to include water in that list.
Well, I mean, they do have water stations out there. They're allowed to have water stations.
Right, but you can't hand it out.
I would say a human being can hand it out.
As long as you're not wearing a shirt or a hat, you're not. If you want to hand out water, fine. I think that's different than whiskey.
I think this is a stupid provision. I think there's bad intent behind the provision. I would not support the provision. Having said that, it is not hard to announce free pizza and water at the polls and set up your table 25 feet away from the line and hand it out as people are going in. You could have big GOTV events, in your community, hand all the snack bags and water bottles and free pizza, and then drive a bus to the polling station from there.
Is forcing people to have their free pizza 25 feet away Jim Crow?
I mean, I don't think it rises to that level. There are clear workarounds here. There are things that you could use as GOTV, mechanisms. I mean, you could have people, following the line with buckets of water bottles and handing them out as people are coming in. And probably people could say, hey, can you hold my spot in line? I'm just going to grab that water bottle and run up to the line and grab the water and come back. I have stood 150 feet from a polling place with electioneering materials, handed them out as people were walking in, had conversations with people going in, and persuaded them on the way in. That's not.
Yeah.
I mean, these are.
It is amazing. There is a. I don't know if this is true anymore, but 20 years ago when I used to be in the political operative world, there were studies that a pretty large percentage of people who showed up at the polls did not know who they were going to vote for down ballot at all. Like I'm going to go vote for Bill Clinton. I'm going to go vote for George Bush. But it was like a crazy high percentage of people had not made up their mind on election day who they were going to vote for. I mean, I worked on a campaign in Frederick, Maryland in 2002, where I think my candidate spent almost $1 million on a state Senate race in 2002. And this was a very high profile, race. And you would go to downtown Frederick, Maryland, every business would have either the Republican sign in their window or the Democratic sign in their window. It was like insane. And then people would come up to me and be like, now, is Alex Mooney the pro-life one, or is he the pro, it's amazing. And these are people who show up to vote, these are not people who stay home. So you really can change people's minds.
And that's exactly where I think electioneering actually has a lot of influence, because people showing up to vote top ticket, don't know anything about down ballot, and are willing to hear, not spend 20 hours, but, say, what's going on with this thing? Do can you give me a little something? I mean, I was campaigning for a ballot initiative for a local property tax increase, and people just didn't know. And I think a lot of people were going in to vote for Bernie. This is the presidential primary, so that people were on the left. And for some people, I said to say, we want to raise taxes to pay for our schools. Oh, I'm down with that. Thanks for telling me. I'll be sure not to skip the ballot question now. But I can do that 150 feet away from the polling place and not miss people. It's not that far. So I think it's very clumsy on the part of the Republicans to put this in, because there's not going to be a lot of benefit they get from it. Yeah. I mean, how many votes are they really saving by having this provision? Because it's so easy to rally around and to get people that food and water and electioneer in the process.
Well, again, especially the water part. I mean, if your vote is going to be bought by water, I mean, we're not in the Sahara Desert, Well,
it's not that it's going to buy it, but it's a chance to have a conversation that you might not otherwise have had. Yeah, which you can still have.
But I don't think that this is as egregious as people are making it out to be. And again, I mean, look, it's Gabriel Sterling. One of remember, Bill, I did my piece in December around Christmas. I did a piece about the political heroes of 2020, and Jim Clyburn was one of them. Well, one of them was Poffensberger. Is that his name?
Raffensperger.
Raffensperger.
I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it too, but
he's the Secretary of State of Georgia. One of them was Sterling. And honestly, the Republican governor of Georgia didn't make my list, I don't think, but he stood up to Donald Trump too. And they're all supporting this. So this is not a Trumpy MAGA thing. This is a mainstream conservative Republican thing.
There's one piece of it that I do think is dirty pool on the Republicans' part. And that is, so they shortened the window between the general election and the runoffs for Georgia. So Georgia has a runoff if you don't get to 50%. That's why, Ossoff and Warnock could win in January, even though they were in second in November. Or maybe Warnock was technically first. I can't remember for his race, but nevertheless, but in like the 30% range. So they shortened the window from 9 weeks to 4 weeks. And if you're an overseas voter who's voting absentee in November, you get to do ranked choice voting. Now, a lot of people in that camp are military voters. And there's a hefty libertarian faction in the military, and those folks are pretty likely. And the libertarian candidate often is the reason why the Republican can't get the 50% in Georgia. Those people get to say, okay, Republican's my second choice, and not have to vote twice, whereas other people will have to show up again 4 weeks later.
That sounds crazy.
I think that's straight up putting the thumb on the scale.
Yeah, I agree. It should be consistent. If it's ranked choice, it's ranked choice. Bill, another area where Biden, didn't get dinged that much at the time for his press conference, he did retroactively. The Washington Post gave him 4 Pinocchios. Biden falsely claims the new Georgia law ends voting hours early. So that's just another example. So actually, go ahead.
Oh, no, if you're going to give the details, go ahead.
During his first news conference, Biden became especially passionate when discussing a law being pressed by Republican lawmakers. Yada, yada, yada. The law has come under fire.
Well, I mean, my understanding here is there were proposals, there were versions of the bill that scale back early voting and try to stop the ability for Democrats to do organizing around black churches on Sundays by curtailing Sunday early voting. But the final version of the bill didn't have that. And so what I think happened here is there was some sloppy staff work that didn't check on the final version of the bill and fed Biden inaccurate talking points. I don't think there was, I highly doubt they knew what was in the bill and then purposely said the opposite of what was in the bill. They just didn't do their due diligence, which, is, you're working in the White House, you should do your freaking due diligence.
Yeah. No, I'm not accusing him of anything other than being wrong. So the Washington Post says, however, the law did make some changes to early voting, but experts say the net effect was to expand the opportunities to vote for most Georgians, not limit them. So it's the exact opposite of what. And
in fact, this is, as an article pointed out, the beneficiaries of the expansion here are the rural voters of Georgia, many of whom are white. So this is actually an example of Republicans, not to say I have anything to do with this, but listening to me and others saying, hey, you need to get your people to embrace early voting and stop trying to deny it to others.
Daddy, Simone made you chocolate. I made chocolate sauce.
This is another April Fool's prank?
No, it's not. Dang it, you didn't get some.
It's very, very salty.
Did you get some? Red pepper in there.
Oh, that's what it is?
Yeah, there's red pepper in it.
I do taste something a little funky.
Yeah, it's red pepper.
Yeah.
And the other after effects are going to hit you in
Daddy,
10.
Yeah?
No.
Tell Matt what we did to you this morning.
Well, why don't you tell the fans?
Well, Simone woke up at 6:20 a.m. to put whipped cream on my dad's hand and a pair of underwear on his head, and we did his makeup, and we wrapped him in toilet paper. And
while he was sleeping.
Well, it was all while he was sleeping.
Yeah.
Bill, I think the patrons, the shareholders, deserve a photo of this. Is there something we could share for the VIPs?
I did take a photo of my. It doesn't have the whipped cream.
Yeah, he ate it in his sleep.
Yeah, he sleep ate it. He's addicted to sugar so much that he sleep ate it.
But here's his makeup and his underwear.
There's the makeover and
a little bit more in front of your face. There you go. Oh wow, that's sexy.
That also has the underwear on the head.
Yeah.
Now, were you conscious at all for this? Okay. You look great. I wouldn't have given that away just now if I were you. I think we could have saved it for the parrot room. But Sure call.
But you
you look like Johnny Depp in Pirates of
not 21 Jump Street.
Well, let's not go that far.
I was an undercover. I'm done. Anyway, so I think there actually was a recognition amongst Republicans that, you know what, suppression really doesn't, maybe we want to suppress the vote in certain areas, but we need to get our people to show up. And some of these suppression tactics, like cracking on early voting, actually hurt us and don't help us. So we actually got to expand a little bit here. So I think that is evidence of that.
I would just to finish up my point, I think that we have to be careful about using really heated rhetoric, because I think it could, words matter. And I think there's a danger in kind of crying wolf. And I also think that when you make, and I'm sure that some of the people who supported this actually did have bad motives. There's no doubt about that. But I think that when you take things that are kind of mainstream conservative positions and label them racist, that could push away people who otherwise might be allies. So I think it's just a bad idea to use that Jim Crow term to describe this. Again, you can criticize it all you want, but I suspect that they're doing it because the goal is the backlash and mobilization.
You know, why? I mean, I think there's a general reason to be careful with those sorts of attacks because they can backfire in the way that you described. I think in this case, we're not seeing that backlash. And this is, you know, parallel to what we're talking about with Joe Biden and partisanship. This is a partisan Georgian Republican bill. There was no attempt to make this a bipartisan bill. So here you are, you got your clock cleaned on election day, and then lo and behold, here's a partisan bill to change how voting works. A lot of people on their face are going to say, you're doing this to, you know, fix your problem, not fix a problem with the body
and it's
politic.
Also, I mean, it's also premised on the big lie, which is that the election was stolen.
Exactly.
I mean,
so
there's no. This is apropos of nothing.
There's no way.
I think that a lot of what's in the bill on the merits is legitimate and possibly even good, but the impetus. There really is no reason to do this now other than a false belief that voter integrity is a big problem right now.
There's no way to change rules, in Congress, to change rules in voting, to do that on a partisan basis without being wide open to the charge that you're trying to rig the rules for yourself, regardless of whatever credence or legitimate basis you have for those rule changes. I mean, that's why the cloture in the Senate was set at 67 for rules changes, because you're not supposed to change rules without it being a consensus position. Rules aren't made to behoove one side over the other. Voting is not designed to behoove one side over the other. And there are people who just believe this point that it is impossible to get the two parties to agree on voting changes because their perspectives and their impetuses are so divergent. But I come back to, there are a lot of things that they actually could agree on if everyone just got over the notion that you're going to get a leg up in this process, because often the case you're not. But I think in this case, Georgia Republicans are getting kicked in the teeth because they went about this in a partisan way, and I think Democrats are going to be able to say Jim Crow here, and partly because this is a state where Jim Crow did occur. It's not a random state where they're applying the label. This is a heart of Jim Crow state historically, and they did this in a way that had no interest or attempt to make this bipartisan and have this be seen as legitimate reform.
All right. Well, there you have it. What do you think? We want to hear from you. sound off in the comments. Are you a Bill or a Matt? Let us know. And we will have, so I'm out next week, Bill, but tomorrow we will have our regularly scheduled DM Zoom, and I'm given to believe that you will find an adequate, possibly even superior replacement for me next week in the DMZ and or in the DM Zoom.
I've not solved that problem, but I'm going to think about it.
Whoever it is, may they not be too good that I lose my conservative chair here. So after a dozen years. Anyway, follow us on Twitter at DMZ Show. Bill, what do you got to plug?
Oh, I got my Talking Filibuster piece of the monthly. I should have something out soon on Biden and judges, because Biden had his first set of judges announced this week, and you might recall I had a piece in the Washington Post last year about how Trump wasn't doing as well with judges as people assume when you look at the numbers. And obviously, Amy Coney Barrett has happened since then, since I wrote that piece, but still my point about lower courts remains true. And when you look at the final results of what Trump got, Republicans now have a very small edge in the total number of lower court judges, and it will not be hard at all for Biden to reverse that, and also for Biden to get Democrats the majority of the appellate courts, because Trump just barely has more Republican majorities on the 13th Circuit courts, and actually that was by a 1-vote margin in the Second Circuit. And even that Republican was really pretty progressive, and that Republican progressive passed away in January. So it's now a tie in that circuit. So already we're dead even on circuit court balance, and Biden's going to be able to tip that, get that Second Circuit Democratic majority very quickly.
All right, well, check out my podcast. My latest is with Daniel Darling about the characters of Easter. So check that out. It's a very special Easter episode. And then next week, I have a podcast coming out with Noah Tishby, who is an Israeli actress and producer who has a book/memoir called Israel, A Simple Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth. Get it wherever you get your podcasts. Bill Scher. Always a pleasure.
I'll see you in the DM Zoom tomorrow with our faithful Patreon supporters.
What the heck is a DM Zoom?
Happy April Fool's Day to everybody.
Happy Easter. Happy Passover. I'll see you on Friday and then 2 weeks from then.
You forgot to say Happy April Fool's.
What about Happy
You forgot to say
April
Happy
Fools?
April Fool's.
Happy April Fools.
Yay!
Oh, do an emoji. React.
I'll text you, Bill.
React. Simone, react.
Yay!
Do a little smiley face.
See you guys.
Bye.
Yay!